At Barbizon Lighting Company. Some of you may know us if you've ever ordered gel or lamps for your fixtures, but I am so thrilled to be talking to you today about why purple isn't a color and other color stories, and a huge thank you to the Richmond Performing Arts Alliance for keeping Lights Up going and making this a virtual experience for you. So what is light? Light is the electromagnetic radiation that is all around us, but that we can actually see. And it travels in waves called nanometers. Now, there's some things about light that you have probably learned without realizing the science behind it. So you know that if you're outside on a sunny day and you're wearing a black t-shirt, you tend to get warmer than if you were wearing a white t-shirt. Well, why is that? That is because white fabric has a higher reflective property than black fabric. So the black is absorbing all of those electromagnetic radiation waves, and it's generating more heat, where the white fabric is going to be reflecting that back, and that's what you see with your eyes.
Let's take a second to look at the full electromagnetic spectrum. You see that the visible light is a very small band among the electromagnetic waves. If gamma rays, X-rays, ultraviolet that we're all familiar with, UVC is the dangerous UV normally blocked by the atmosphere. UVB and UVA are what we block with sunscreen. Then we have visible light. Then we have infrared, which might be something you have in your house, like your remote control for one of your electronic devices. And then, of course, we're all familiar with radio waves.
So the first light source ever was, of course, the sun, right? And the sun was sending us light in a completely full spectrum. If you've ever taken a light with a prism and you see it expand into the rainbow, right? All of that is the same thing that's coming from our sun. And it comes through our atmosphere, where the ozone layer and other elements in the atmosphere block out that harmful UVC light I was talking about. Lets some of the UVA and UVB through, why we use sunscreen, but then particles start scattering as they hit other parts of the atmosphere. And because blue waves are the shortest, they scatter the most, and that's why our sky looks blue. By the time that the light has bounced off of all of the surfaces around us, it has bounced off of green leaves and red bricks and blue skies, it's all sort of jumbled together again, even though it had originally scattered. And that's why the light we see when we just sort of look outside and we're like, oh, what beautiful white light from the sun. It's where everything has scattered and then come back together after reflecting and refracting off of everything around it in the environment. So now let's talk about how our eyes are perceiving things. So our eyes have rods and cones on the back side, right? So the light, the waves go through our pupils and they react with the rods and the cones. Now the rods are really what we use to help with low light vision, but the cones are where we start perceiving color. And we have three kinds of cones in our eyes: red and green and blue. So all of the colors that we perceive are perceived by those sensors doing a whole lot of math and then communicating with their brain about what we're looking at. If you have any friends who are sort of like Lydia from Beetlejuice, right? And everything's sort of a dark, drab, what's the purpose world. Everything is dark and lonely. Well, in the absence of light, a lot of things really feel that way. If you walk into a room in your house during the daytime, you may notice brightly colored curtains or a bright tablecloth or a bright carpet or even bright wall color. But if you were to walk into that same room in the evening, it's not going to have that same vibrancy. And that is because there are no light waves of certain spectrums that are reflecting off of those objects to create that vibrancy in your cones and rods and ultimately in your brain and what you perceive.
As you can see here, the light source, be it natural or artificial, enters through the pupil of the eye and travels back to the red, green, and blue cones at the rear of the eye. As I've already mentioned, light travels in waves called nanometers. Shortest ones are blue, green falls somewhere in the middle, and the longest waves are what we perceive as red. This illustration shows at exactly what point we have the greatest retinal response to blue, green, and red. It also includes our rods, which is just more general dim to bright detection.
So now is when I'm going to talk about my favorite big word in this workshop, and that word is metamerism. So metamerism is how our eyes receive the information and calculate what color it's going to tell our brain we are looking at. So you may be looking at something that looks green. So it may look green because it is absorbing all light that isn't right at the green spectrum, so you see green. Or you could be seeing green because it is reflecting things from the blue and the yellow spectrums of light wavelengths, and you're interpreting it that way sort of by doing the math. So if you want to think about it really as math, 9 and 1 equal 10, 8 and 2 equal 10, 7 and 3 equal 10, 6 and 4 and 5 and 5. Your end result could be the same from a bunch of different formulas of information that is your body is telling you what you're looking at.
So to wrap up metamerism, in colorimetry, metamerism is a perceived matching of colors with different non-matching spectral power distributions. Color that match this way are called metamers. So now we've made it to spectral luminosity, which is basically the measure of light seen by the human eye. Spectral, meaning what we can optically observe, and luminosity, which is the rate of emission of radiation from the light itself. Once we combine the color spectrum with the luminosity sensitivity, we end up with a graph that looks like this. Is anyone on your artistic team colorblind? Maybe somebody in your family? Maybe even yourself. You'll find that when you're discussing colors with them, there are parts of the spectrum that they will see very differently from you. Most common color blindness involves red and green and makes them look gray or dull. Let's look at the spectral power distributions of some different light sources, some natural, some artificial. So when you look in the up left corner, you'll see that daylight has every wavelength represented in the visible spectrum. Sunset also has every wavelength available in the visible spectrum, but it has a huge shift to red. Just think about what a beautiful sunset looks like compared to the first one of daylight that is more high noon when everything feels very bright and white and crisp. In contrast, we have been moving theatrical fixtures over to LED, mostly to save on power consumption, but it also has some other advantages that we'll get to in a little bit. But it's still not as pretty as natural light. If you look in the bottom left corner, you will see that LEDs tend to leave out a lot of the blue. They certainly are not peaking in the yellow, and red is sort of left behind. Before LEDs, when we were using incandescents, much like a regular filament light you may have at home, we had something that, while didn't mimic daylight, certainly came closer to mimicking something in nature and resembling more of a sunset. So think about the warm glow in your den in the evening. Now, fluorescent lights were the original ones that came out as a way to save on power usage. But as you can see, their spectral curve is a bit of a mess. It kind of looks like one of those grow your own crystal rock experiments in a terrarium. Now together, for a warm fluorescent, adding up those wavelengths as broken apart as they are is still going to give you a sunset effect in your overall color. If you look below that one, you'll see the cool fluorescent. So while it has very narrow peaks of wavelengths, going back to our favorite word, metamerism, they still add up to create that white daylight effect. If you're a lighting designer or have ever worked with a lighting designer, then you've probably seen a gel swatch book. It is really meant to be a sample of all the color options that you can buy to color correct an incandescent theatrical fixture. The way they work is that they block the wavelengths of light you don't want to see and only let through the wavelengths of light that you do want to see. If you look at this chart, I have chosen R80 primary blue. But you'll notice that this primary blue still lets a lot of red wavelengths through. You'll also see that when it's blocking out the yellow and a lot of the green and orange hues, that it reduces the transmission of the light to 9%. So the light that you had coming out of the fixture in just the lamp without a filter would have been 100%. So you can see that with darker colors, you lose a lot of the intensity of the fixture. Here you see a comparison of two blue gels from two different gel manufacturers, Roscoe on the left and Lee on the right. You'll notice that the dark blue made by Lee filters drops out almost all of the red wavelengths completely, unlike the Roscoe. So if you were going to light a red costume, you would want to use the color filter that still allowed the red light through so that the reflective properties of the costume could bounce the red back to the audience. Quiz time. What is the brightest color in the spectrum? When would the cones in your eyes be the most excited? If you guessed yellow, you're correct. Yellow is the point on the spectrum where we see the greatest intensity.
So another example of how you may see two colors, but they look very similar, would be to look at something like a lemon, right? In this case, you're looking at it on a screen, so you're not seeing it first person. But for me here, I am looking at this yellow lemon, and this lemon appears to be reflecting the wavelengths of light to me that are yellow. Now, on this next slide, I'm going to show you something that was always intended to be a video illustration of the color yellow. Now, when you're looking at something like a TV screen or a computer monitor or even your cell phone, you're not really looking at true yellow like you would be staring at this lemon. You are looking at a combination of red and green that merged together on your screen creates the image of yellow.
Mr. Smiley looks yellow to you, but because this is a virtual screen and not a pigment, Mr. Smiley is really created by the combination of red and green emitters.
Another reason that we tend to detect more green or red light than we do blue light is just in the number of rods and cones that we have in our eye. The next slide sort of illustrates that ratio, so you can sort of get a visual representation of why we have so many more detectors for red and green.
Not only does this show you the rough distribution of your red, green, and blue cones, you may also notice that just in the colors that the red and green stand out more, and you have to sort of search to see the blue. So by now you're asking yourself, how do I use all of this information as an artist? Now that we've talked about how we perceive color and how we mix colors in our brain, let's talk about color theory. So primary colors that we grew up knowing about when we were dealing with pigments were red and yellow and blue. But the primary colors in lighting are different. It's red and green and blue. And we make our secondary colors when we mix them, giving us cyan, magenta, and yellow. Please take a moment to look at the pie charts at the top, and you'll notice that the one that's labeled tertiary goes beyond secondary color and starts to look a lot like the color picker you might see on a theatrical light board. Color harmony relates to the colors on the color wheel and what their relationship to one another is. In color context, we see that a color may look different based on what it is next to. So red stands out on a black background and even a white background, but sort of fades away on an orange background or a purple background. Color properties go into whether or not something is cool, warm, bright, dark, saturated, or desaturated. That goes back to talking about situations where you may not have a lot of light reflecting off of a surface, making it look darker. And then color modes: red, green, blue, cyan, magenta, yellow, black. You have hues, which is the saturation and how much color exists, and grayscale, which is just black and white only. What you have to remember with color is that color is always a reflection of light. In the absence of light, everything is dark. As we have evolved as a species, we have associated certain colors with certain things in our environment. Some of these things that were created through biology and to help with survival was equating fire to red, the sky to blue, green to plants, yellow to sunshine. But then there are the societal driven connections that we make, such as baby boys getting blue booties and baby girls getting pink booties. Those aren't a part of our biology. They're just part of a social construct. You may have noticed that even going down the soap aisle in the grocery store, that certain color associations are true there. Blue and green make you think things are clean and fresh. And you'll notice that the free and clear laundry detergents often come in a white bottle to symbolize purity. When it comes to some major fast food chains, I don't believe they chose red for their branding as a way to communicate fire, love, or passion. In this case, they've chosen the red and the yellow because they stand out, and as we're driving down the road, we're going to take notice of it more quickly than we would something that looks earthy and brown and drab. Now we're going to do a little experiment. I need you to stare at the center of your screen for 20 seconds. When I changed slides, you should have noticed that for just a second, this white screen looked cyan. Cyan being the complementary color to the red that you had just been staring at. This happens because much like a camera wants to white balance, our eyes want to white balance too. So if you're staring at something that is multiple hues or shades of red, your eyes will try to adjust and tell your brain that that red is shifting towards white. So when you return to a true white situation with a full color spectrum, you're going to notice the complementary color until your eyes readjust. This is a really great way to play with costumes and trick of the eye. Perhaps you want somebody to be revealed in a red costume, but the beginning of the scene feels very dark and drab. If you put some cyan on the costume through a gel, it will look drab and dull with little to reflect the red nature of the fabric. And then you can change it to something that does have red in it, maybe even the blue that we saw earlier that had the high red wavelengths, and all of a sudden the beauty of the fabric will be revealed. So on a new topic, what color do you think your shadow is? Thinking of your options, do you think it would be red, blue, black, cyan, or maybe even something else? And the answer is, it depends. If you're in a controlled environment with a single source of light, then your shadow will probably just be black. But once you start adding reflective surfaces and other lights, creating ambient light and color around you, you will find that shadows take on a whole new meaning. Think about walking down the sidewalk during the summer, and you may notice that your shadow has a blue hue to it. And that would be from the blue light reflecting off of the sky back down on the ground, while the sunlight is being blocked by your body. So now let's take all of this color theory to the stage. For this portion of the presentation, I am using 3 LED theatrical fixtures. They have red, green, and blue diodes in them. So first, we're going to talk about making amber. It seems very unintuitive that green and red together would create a color that was brighter. But when you think about it, we're going back to metamerism, and it's all about wavelengths adding together to create a perceived color. With the red and green diodes both on at full, we sort of get a greenish yellow color, shifting towards amber. Had I used a light board, I could have reduced the intensity of the green and gotten a truer orangey amber output. Now let's see what happens when we put our model in front of the lights. On the left, you're looking at a single LED fixture with red and green diodes on coming out of the same unit. On the right, I have set one light to green and the other to only red. Please notice the change in the shadows by using two different fixtures to create the same color. But by now, you're probably still thinking that I haven't talked a whole lot about purple. Well, here we are. So here is an example of, on the left, the purple is being created by two separate light fixtures side by side. And on the right, it is being created by a single fixture that has both the red and blue diodes at full. Based on what you know, take a moment to look at the two pictures and see if you can figure out which one is coming from a single source and which one is made by two sources or two fixtures. If you answered that the single source was the image on the right, you're correct. Now, where this comes into play is if you've got a really sad and somber moment in a play, you may want the dark shadows on your scenery or your talent. But if it's the big musical number, it may be a lot more fun to have the dimension created by the colorful blue and red shadows in the background, or even in the folds of the costumes. Going back to color theory for a little bit, here's an example of red and some of the emotions that we may feel when we look at red. Is there a fire? Is this something very passionate happening? Is this a backdrop? Is this a costume? It could be anything on stage. But when you have just an intense red light on it, it definitely sends a message. But then what happens when the red light is taken away and you're left with green? The way this image makes you feel may change completely. Suddenly, I feel like I'm more in a jungle. Let's not forget the blue diodes, and they create a completely different feeling than red or green. So let's look at all three together and discuss why the fabric looks so different under different colored light. When looking at the red image, we have filtered out all of the green and blue wavelengths of light, so only the red wavelengths are getting through to reflect off of the fabric. Likewise with the green, we have filtered out the red and blue, are only letting the green wavelengths through, so the properties of the fabric that reflect green are active. And lastly, with the blue, we filtered out the red and the green, so only the wavelengths that reflect off of the blue are bouncing back at us. Now see what happens when we combine a red light and a green light on this fabric. We still don't have blue, so we're not noticing any of the blue in the fabric yet. So check out what happens when we replace the red with the blue. So now all you have are blue and green wavelengths hitting the fabric. And here's a little side-by-side comparison. And here's what happens when we overlap a red light, a green light, and a blue light on the fabric. You'll see where they overlap the most, you have an intense white. Unlike pigment, as you add layers of light and add wavelengths, you move towards white instead of dark. Now this is that exact same fabric, but in daylight. As we discussed earlier, daylight contains every color in the visible spectrum. Okay, so I'm not really going to give you homework. But if you want to continue exploring the concepts that we've discussed today, I highly recommend some projects at home just for hands-on experience.
So some fun things that you can do at home, even without the access to true theatrical performance lighting, is if you have some sort of like Mio fruit mix or Kool-Aid or food coloring, you should absolutely try to take some clear glasses and then maybe shoot some flashlights through it, and you can really sort of play with your own color theory at home. A fun project to do at home for all of you sugar lovers is to see if you can get hold of a light that is red or blue or green, and then shine it on some M&Ms with that as the only light source, and see if it's hard or easy, or how colors go together if you try to sort them under just a primary color of light. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that you learned a little bit more about color and light and how we perceive it, and maybe some ways that you can use it in your lighting design future. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I can be found at Daughtrey@barbizon.com. That is GDAUGHTREY at Barbizon, BARBIZON.com. Hope you have a great day. Stay safe.